AP 120, Chapter 12, Topics, Blood Basics and Erythrocytes. So, blood is our liquid connective tissue. As you can see in this lovely blood bag. And blood is a complex mixture of cells, chemicals, and of course the plasma, the fluid. And it turns out in the average sized adult, blood volume is about 5 liters. Seems like an awful lot. And functions of blood include transporting substances throughout the body. Very, very important, moving things throughout the body, nutrients, wastes, oxygen, carbon dioxide, hormones, etc. Blood also helps to maintain a stable interstitial fluid environment. Interstitial, that's between the cells, that's in the tissues. The fluid in our tissues comes from blood. So the stability of blood's composition affects the stability of those fluids. And this is, of course, important for homeostasis, or maintaining a stable internal environment. And finally, blood can also distribute heat throughout the body. Here is a cartoon view of blood under a microscope where you see red blood cells, platelets, and white blood cells. And they are referred to as formed elements because technically red blood cells and platelets aren't officially cells. So when you take blood, you can put it in a centrifuge, spin it really, really fast, and the contents of the blood will separate so that you have the red blood cells toward the bottom, a thin little white layer called the buffy coat, and then the plasma, the fluid portion. And approximately 55% of whole blood is plasma, and then the other 45% is red blood cells. And the amount that your blood is, in terms of red blood cells, is called the hematocrit. So expect your hematocrit to be around 45%. So as I mentioned, blood has that fluid portion called plasma. Plasma is mostly water, 92% water. But again, it has other things, electrolytes, proteins, waste, nutrients, vitamins, hormones, gases, so on. And then we have the formed elements, with red blood cells being the main component. 95% of our formed elements, our blood cells, are red blood cells, with approximately 4.8 or so platelets and 0.1% white blood cells. So here is a cartoon view of erythrocyte. You can see it looks kind of like a donut that hasn't had the center cut through all the way. They have a relative specific size. And what do? Well, they carry oxygen from the lungs to the tissues of the body. So red blood cells, erythrocytes, their function is to carry oxygen from the lungs to the tissues of the body. So in our red bone marrow, again, red bone marrow is where all blood cells are produced. And there is a set of stem cells, hematopoietic stem cells, hemato related to blood. So they produce all of the blood cells, and then through a process called erythropoiesis, poiesis generation, erythro for the red blood cells, we get our red blood cells produced. And during this process, the red blood cell actually loses its nucleus and most of its other organelles. So that basically a red blood cell has just lots of hemoglobin within it, no nucleus, and most of its organelles are missing. So that's why it's a formed element. It's technically not a cell since it doesn't have a nucleus. Red blood cells, since they have no mitochondria, the ATP they need is produced solely through glycolysis or fermentation. So that, as we know, means that one glucose molecule yields 2 ATP, very, very inefficient. And red blood cells, erythrocytes, live only for around 120 days. So they're functional for about 120 days, and then they have to be recycled. So as we know, the red blood cells, the erythrocytes, are biconcave discs filled with hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a protein, and when it is carrying oxygen, when it is oxygenated, it is bright red. And when it lacks oxygen, when it's deoxygenated, hemoglobin is darker red. So our blood is bright red when it's oxygenated and darker red when it is not. And blood is never blue. Blood is never blue. Just want you to know that. Your blood is never blue. All right, as we mentioned, the number of red blood cells, the percentage of red blood cells in your blood is considered important because that relates to the oxygen carrying capacity of your blood and is referred to as the hematocrit. So again, 45% is around average for most people. Now, if your hematocrit was exceptionally low, then you would have anemia. And anemia means you have a low oxygen carrying capacity. You're not able to transport as much oxygen in your blood as would be desired. So, as we know, when low oxygen levels in the blood are detected, this acts as a positive stimulus to cause the release of the hormone erythropoietin. So the hormone erythropoietin, either produced by the liver and or the kidneys, goes into the bloodstream and then travels through the blood to the red bone marrow, where it increases the production of red blood cells. So the hormone erythropoietin goes into the bloodstream, stimulates the red bone marrow to produce more erythrocytes, and then this will lead to increased levels of oxygen in the blood, and this acts as the negative inhibitor to say, hey, we don't need any more of that hormone produced. Strange, huh? Your liver and your kidneys help to control red blood cell production. You can, of course, have the opposite problem from anemia, and that's polycythemia. Polycythemia is when your red blood cell levels is greater than 55%. This is a problem because it causes the blood to become very viscous, very thick, and that causes it to move more slowly through the bloodstream. This causes the heart to have to work harder, causes blood pressure to get higher, and can lead to a cascade of problems because of the high blood pressure and the heart having to work so hard. All right, dietary factors that can help with red blood cells, vitamins B12 and folic acid. These vitamins are important for DNA synthesis, and since at first the pre-red blood cells are possessing nucleuses, you need adequate levels of vitamins B12 and folic acid to get proper cell division to produce the red blood cells. Also, you need iron. You need sufficient levels of iron. Iron is necessary for functional hemoglobin. So that protein hemoglobin uses iron, needs iron to bind oxygen. So if you have low iron levels, then the hemoglobin produced will not be able to bind to as much oxygen. Luckily, our body tries to conserve as much iron as possible, so we have systems to recycle it. All right, low red blood cell levels or low amounts of functional hemoglobin leads again to anemia. So in someone who's anemic, one thing you could look for is fewer red blood cells than expected. The other would be lower levels of iron in their blood than expected. So anemia can have a lot of different side effects depending on what's causing the anemia. If you're having abnormal breakdown of red blood cells, you could get yellowing of the eyes, yellowing of the skin. You can have paleness, coldness, shortness of breath, weakness. If it's internal bleeding that's the issue, you could have a change in stool color. General anemia can lead to fatigue and dizziness, lower blood pressure, especially if you're internally bleeding, heart problems. And if anemia is severe enough, it can lead to fainting, chest pain, and even heart attack. So definitely something you want to manage if anemia is an issue for you. Now, one specific kind of anemia is called sickle cell anemia. This particular type is a genetic disorder that some people may have, where their red blood cells do not have the normal biconcave disc shape, but instead are sort of curved, sort of sickle-shaped and jagged. And one problem with this cell-shaped red blood cells is that they then rupture much more easily, which would then, of course, lead to anemia and other complications. So, life cycle of an erythrocyte. Well, it starts off, of course, with nutrients being absorbed in the bloodstream going to the red bone marrow. Then within the red bone marrow, nutrients, etc., are utilized to make the red blood cells. The red blood cells leave the red bone marrow, go into the bloodstream, and circulate for about 120 days. Then, when it gets to the end of the lifespan for the red blood cells, they need to be recycled. So macrophages in the liver and in the spleen will break down old red blood cells to recycle their components. And then the hemoglobin gets sent to the liver. So if the red blood cell is broken down in the liver, then the hemoglobin's already there. If it's broken down in the spleen, then the spleen will send the hemoglobin to the liver. There, the liver will break the hemoglobin into its component parts, the globin primarily protein portion and the heme, where we find the iron. And then the iron is recycled, is sent back to the red bone marrow, and the remaining component of heme is secreted in bile. So the bilirubin, the breakdown component of heme that does not have iron, is sent to the gallbladder to be part of bile. And this is basically how the life cycle of the red blood cell functions, as well as the recycling of iron. And that is it for this lecture.